Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive, where we dig into some really fascinating research. Today, we're going to be looking at something I think is incredibly important to all of us, especially if you are a consultant or if you work with consultants. We're going to be taking a deep dive into the world of ego development and how it relates to being an effective consultant.
Yeah, it's a fascinating area. We often focus so much on, the tangible skills and experience when we're thinking about consultants, but this underlying kind of hidden dimension of someone's personal development really plays a huge role.
So ego development, I think for some people that might sound a little intimidating or maybe a little too out there. Can you break that down for us a little bit? What exactly are we talking about when we say ego development?
Sure. So think of it as like a journey of personal growth and how we understand ourselves, other people, and the world. And, it's really about increasing the complexity of how we make sense of things.
So our source material for this deep dive is this dissertation by T. Binder. And it's really interesting because the pioneering researcher in this area, Jane Loevinger, she used a sentence completion test to actually measure ego development.
Yeah, isn't that fascinating? I mean, just filling in the blanks, can really reveal a lot about how someone sees the world.
Definitely. And it turns out she outlined 10 distinct stages of ego development. And get this, most people don't even reach the highest levels.
Which, it really makes you think about the potential we all have, right?
Absolutely. So 10 stages, that's quite a journey. So we're not just talking about like gaining knowledge or experience here, right? This is something much deeper.
Yeah. It's really about like fundamental shifts in our perspective.
Yeah.
Moving from these simple understandings to more nuanced understandings.
How we make meaning of the world, how we approach problems. So how does all of this tie back to being a good consultant, especially in a field where you're dealing with really complex situations and you have to navigate relationships with clients and all these different stakeholders?
Right. So Bunder's dissertation looked at these competence requirements from several German consulting associations. Yeah. And what emerges are these themes like self-awareness, emotional stability, managing conflict, and the ability to hold multiple perspectives.
I mean, those are really valuable qualities for anyone, not just a consultant.
Yeah, absolutely. But think about the specific demands of consulting, right? You're dealing with ambiguity, you're building trust, you're facilitating change. And all of these processes are so deeply intertwined with someone's stage of ego development.
So are you saying that someone at a lower stage of ego development, even if they have the skills and the knowledge, might struggle in those situations?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And there's actually a quote from the Competence Guidelines of the DPZC, which is a German consulting association, that I think really captures this well. It says, "A coach must be able to use themselves effectively as a tool in consulting, beyond the need for self-promotion, but also beyond self-denial."
Wow, that's powerful. So it really speaks to this level of self-awareness and being able to kind of manage your ego in a way that's conducive to that work.
Exactly, yeah.
So as we move through those 10 stages of ego development, what specifically changes? What are the key areas that evolve as our ego develops?
Yeah, so Loevinger identified 4 key areas. First, there's character, so how we manage impulses, develop moral frameworks.
So is it possible that someone at a lower stage of ego development, might struggle with regulating their emotions or even acting ethically in certain situations?
Yeah, potentially. And that directly impacts the second area, which is interpersonal style. So how we relate to others.
Yeah.
Are we manipulative, collaborative, or are we truly connecting?
Are we putting the client's needs above our own?
Yeah, exactly. And consultants at lower ego stages, they might prioritize their own needs, potentially damaging that trust with the client.
That makes sense. So we've got character and interpersonal style, and I think those are really crucial, especially for building trust. What about the other 2 areas?
Sure. So the third one is conscious focus. So what are our primary concerns? Early stages are often, focused on external appearances and social acceptance.
Kind of those more superficial things.
Right. But then later stages shift to internal motivations and deeper values.
So it sounds like our focus as we develop really moves from, what other people think of us to what we think of ourselves and what really matters to us deep down.
Exactly. Yeah. And then lastly, there's cognitive style. So how we think and make sense of the world, right? Mm-hmm. Can we hold multiple perspectives? Are we comfortable with ambiguity?
That's huge, especially in consulting where things are rarely black and white. It sounds like ego development impacts not just what we know, but also how we approach problems and even understand people's motivations.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
So we've talked about some of the core concepts, but I'm really curious to see how this plays out in the real world. What's the actual evidence that ego development really matters in consulting?
Yeah, that's the key question, right?
Yeah.
And Binder highlights a number of really fascinating studies that kind of bring this connection to life.
Okay, let's hear about those.
So one study that I found really compelling was by Borders and Fong back in 1989, and they actually found a significant correlation between the consultant's ego development stage and client satisfaction.
That makes sense given what we've been talking about, but what's the dynamic there? What are consultants at those higher levels actually doing that leads to happier clients?
Well, it's probably a combination of factors, right? They're likely better at things like active listening, demonstrating empathy, really understanding the client's perspective.
So it's not just about coming in and having the answers, but really being able to hear what the client is saying and where they're coming from.
Exactly, yeah. And because they're more self-aware, they're probably less likely to get thrown off balance by challenging situations or, difficult clients. They can regulate their emotions, approach conflict maybe a little bit more constructively rather than defensively.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, if you're working with a consultant and they seem really calm and centered, even when things get tough, that's got to inspire a lot more confidence.
Absolutely. And then, we talked about this earlier, but consultants at higher ego development stages are also better at holding multiple perspectives. So they can see the bigger picture, understand different viewpoints, and help facilitate solutions that work for everyone involved.
Yeah, they can hold that complexity without getting overwhelmed or resorting to, the simplistic solutions.
Right, exactly. It's about, creating that space where the client feels safe to explore challenges and really work toward meaningful change. Now, shifting gears a little bit, there was another study that I found fascinating. This one was by Allen in 1980.
Yeah.
And it focused on therapists, but I think the insights are very relevant to consulting.
Oh, I'm intrigued. How so?
Well, Allen found that therapists at different ego development stages, they process their internal reactions to clients very differently. So therapists at lower stages, they were more likely to kind of externalize blame, thinking things like, oh, this client is being difficult or they're the problem.
Right. It's easier to point fingers than to look inward. Right. Especially when things are, stressful or challenging.
Exactly. But therapists at higher ego development stages, they showed much deeper self-reflection. They were more likely to ask themselves, what's going on inside of me that's making this interaction so difficult?
Yeah.
Or how might my own perspective or approach be contributing to these challenges?
Wow, that's a big difference. It seems like that level of self-awareness is so important in any kind of helping profession, whether you're a therapist or a coach or a consultant.
Absolutely. And it's not just about, managing difficult clients, but it's about constantly reflecting on your role in the dynamic and taking responsibility for your part. Now, there's one last study I want to mention. And this one I think is really interesting because it highlights the impact of ego development on critical thinking. This one is by Candie from 1974, and it focused on political activism.
Okay, this is interesting. How does ego development relate to political activism?
So what Candie found was that despite all the participants having high cognitive abilities, only those at higher ego stages really questioned the deeper purpose and values behind their activism. Those at lower stages were more likely to get caught up in the excitement of the cause, maybe following the crowd without really examining those underlying motivations.
So even with intelligence and good intentions, if your ego development isn't there, you might miss the bigger picture.
Yeah, you might not be asking those deeper, more meaningful questions, which, makes you think, does this apply to other areas of life, right? Business decisions, relationships, even how we choose our news sources.
It's a fascinating question to consider. Okay, so we've talked about how important this is, but can we actually do anything about it? Can we actively work on boosting our own ego development?
Yeah.
Or are we kind of stuck at whatever level we happen to be at?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting. Binder actually explores whether training programs can specifically target and accelerate ego development.
Oh, okay. I'm all ears.
The good news is that it's not set in stone.
Right.
While it is a lifelong process, it can be accelerated within certain environments, particularly those that are rich in learning and feedback and, opportunities for self-reflection. And Binder highlights some research by Sprinthal from 1994. And Sprinthal found that interventions using social role-taking exercises actually had a really significant positive impact on ego development.
Social role-taking. What does that involve?
So it's about stepping outside of our usual perspective and trying to see the world through the eyes of others. So, really trying to develop empathy, understand different viewpoints, and challenge our own assumptions.
It sounds like those aha moments, like when we have a sudden insight or we make a connection, those can actually lead to real developmental shifts.
Yeah, that's the idea. Now, Binder also included a study in his dissertation that compared ego development in supervision trainees versus MBA students. And while both groups showed progress over the course of their respective programs, the supervision group actually started and ended at slightly higher levels.
That's interesting. Why do you think that is?
It likely has to do with the nature of the training. Supervision training inherently involves a lot of self-reflection, emotional processing, focus on interpersonal dynamics, all of which can nurture that ego development.
So it's not just about the knowledge and the skills, but it's about the types of experiences that we're having that really challenge us to grow and evolve as human beings.
Exactly. And it raises this really thought-provoking question. Should consulting training programs explicitly address and nurture ego development?
Given what we know, it seems like it would almost be irresponsible not to, considering the impact it has not just on the consultant's effectiveness, but also on client satisfaction and even their own well-being.
It's definitely something to consider, and it leads to another important aspect of this whole discussion. How do we even assess our own ego development level?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, is it as simple as taking a test? Or is it more about just kind of like deep introspection?
Oh, it's a little more nuanced than that. Loevinger's model actually suggests that there's an asymmetry of understanding when it comes to ego development.
Asymmetry of understanding, I'm not sure I follow.
Essentially, it means that individuals at lower stages of ego development have difficulty really understanding the perspectives and motivations of those at higher stages.
So it's kind of like trying to explain quantum physics to someone who hasn't even grasped basic algebra.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. And here's where it gets tricky, right? Because of this asymmetry, we might actually perceive ourselves as being at a higher stage of development than we actually are. We don't have the framework to grasp those later, more complex stages.
Whoa, that's a little bit of a mind bender. So how do we overcome that blind spot? How can we get a more objective sense of where we're really at on this developmental journey?
Well, it often requires seeking feedback from others, particularly those who are likely at those later stages of development themselves. So therapists, coaches, mentors who are familiar with Loevinger's model, they can provide some really valuable insight.
So this is not a solo journey. We need those outside perspectives to help us see ourselves more clearly.
Exactly. And even then, it's an ongoing process. Ego development isn't a destination. It's a lifelong journey of growth and evolution.
Well said. I think that's a perfect note to wrap up on today.
Indeed. We've covered a lot of ground, exploring the impact that ego development has on consulting, client satisfaction, and really the consultant's well-being.
We've learned that it's not just about acquiring knowledge or mastering techniques, but about evolving as human beings, expanding our perspectives, deepening our self-awareness.
And while we've drawn extensively from T. Binder's dissertation and the work of Jane Loevinger, this deep dive is really just a starting point.
So, dear listener, as you go forth with the world of consulting or collaboration or just, navigating your own personal growth, here's a final thought-provoking question to ponder. Knowing what you now know about ego development, what steps can you take to foster growth in this area, both for yourself and for those you work with?
Thank you for joining us on the deep dive. Until next time, keep seeking, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.
So we've established that assessing our own ego development can be really tricky because of this whole asymmetry of understanding thing. But let's say someone is listening and they're really intrigued by this concept. They want to explore their own ego development. Where would they even begin?
Well, it really highlights one of the more challenging aspects of all of this. It's not like you can just take a test and get a definitive answer.
Right, because like we were talking about earlier, if we're at a lower stage, we might not even be aware of it. So what's the solution there? How can we get a more accurate understanding?
One of the best ways is to get feedback from others.
Yeah.
And especially from people who are likely at later stages of development themselves.
So like therapists, coaches, mentors, people who are really familiar with Loevinger's model and can kind of, give us some insights based on their own experience and understanding.
Exactly.
It seems like having those outside perspectives is so crucial because we can't always rely on our own self-perception, especially when it comes to something as complex as ego development.
Yeah, for sure. And even with feedback, it's important to keep in mind that ego development is an ongoing process. It's not about reaching some endpoint and saying, okay, I'm good now. I've arrived.
It's a journey, not a destination. And it's a journey that I think is so worth taking, especially for folks in the consulting world. The more we understand ourselves and where we are in our own development, the better equipped we are to support our clients and navigate all those complex dynamics that come up in that kind of work.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Well, this has been a truly fascinating deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground, from the basics of ego development to how it plays out in consulting, and even touched on how we can start to assess our own development.
We've explored how it impacts our effectiveness, client satisfaction, and even our own well-being as consultants, and how it goes beyond just skills and knowledge.
It's really about our own personal evolution, right?
Absolutely.
So to our listeners, as you go back to your work, your relationships, or just your own personal growth journey, we'll leave you with this final question to reflect on. What steps can you take to foster growth in this area, both for yourself and for the people you work with? It's a question worth pondering, and it's a journey worth taking.
Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive. Until next time, keep seeking, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into all those fascinating complexities of human experience.